So imagine for a second that we live in this alternate reality where you could scan your entire brain and effectively upload your mind into a computer. And what you end up with is this digital copy that talks like you, it remembers your life, and it even says that it feels happy or sad similar to how you would. But that leaves us to wonder, does this uploaded mind actually feel anything like we do? And even if it does, would it really be you that's living in there, or is this just some kind of very convincing imitation? And these are the types of questions that lead us into this really interesting philosophical puzzle called the hard problem of consciousness, and that's what I want to talk about today. In short, this is the challenge of explaining specifically how and why we have subjective experiences, specifically the raw sensations and feelings that we call qualia, and I'll explain what that means later on. Because it's one thing to explain how the brain processes information or controls behavior, and we understand that through fields like psychology and neuroscience. And of course that's difficult, but that's considered the easy part for the purposes of our problem. The hard part, and the hard problem of consciousness, is understanding why all that processing should come with an inner life like what we experience. In other words, like, why do certain brain cells firing make us experience things like a bright red rose or the pangs of jealousy? Why is there something that it feels like to be you on the inside? Because we all know what it feels like to, let's say, taste chocolate or feel pain, but those experiences can't be fully captured by just describing the brain signals or computer data. And this fundamental gap between, on one hand, physical stuff, and on the other hand, first-person experience, is what philosopher David Chalmers famously dubbed the hard problem of consciousness. And it's a problem that makes us wonder if a perfect computer simulation of a brain would have any spark of awareness, or if it would just be a clever kind of zombie, which acts human but doesn't have lights on the inside. And if a computer could feel and think like us, would that mean a mind, or maybe your mind, could be in some way uploaded into a machine and still be the same person? Or would something really important be lost along the way, like your soul somehow slipping out during this uploading or copying? And so, overall, in this presentation, we're going to explore these questions step by step. First, we're going to start by unpacking what philosophers actually mean by the hard problem of consciousness and what qualia, or raw sensations and experiences, actually are. And then we're going to dive into these futuristic ideas of mind uploading, including different models of how uploading might work, like destructive brain scans or gradual cyborg-style replacements. Along the way, we're going to draw on insights from philosopher Tim Crane's book, Mechanical Mind, and David Chalmers' Reality Plus, to think about whether a digital mind could have a subjective experience or maintain a personal identity like we do. But this won't just be abstract theory. Afterwards, I'm going to connect this to stories and media that bring these ideas to life, and specifically 3 that have been really important to me throughout my life. So first, we're going to see how these themes echo in DeLillo's novel White Noise, and we're going to look at this through the lens of philosopher Baudrillard's Simulacra and what he calls the loss of the real. After that, the second thing is we're going to look at a surreal show called Serial Experiments Lain, where the digital interfacing ends up fracturing a young girl's identity in a really cool and interesting way. And finally, the third thing we're going to look at is this music subculture called Vocaloid, as this really surprisingly hopeful take on how technology can actually help us express and enhance our humanity, as opposed to kind of the bleak representation seen in the previous 2 pieces of media. Hopefully by the end, my goal isn't to give you a very neat and tidy answer like uploading is good or uploading is bad, because reality is often messier than that, but that's what makes it a lot more interesting. Instead, my goal is to help you see that in some ways, uploading is already happening in our lives through digital extensions of ourselves, and the real question becomes, how do we do this in a way that kind of maintains what we actually find important, that preserves and enriches like human agency, connection, and spirit? So overall, let's begin with the beginning, with the mysterious spark of consciousness itself. So every day, each of us experiences the world from a first-person perspective, of course. For example, right now you might be hearing my voice, or seeing text on a screen, or feeling the warmth of a coffee mug in your hand. And these raw sensations are examples of what we'd call qualia, or the quote-unquote what it's like aspects of conscious experience. For example, there's really something fundamentally undescribable and personal about what it's like to actually see red or see a color that you can't fully describe to someone who's never seen the color before. Because, yeah, they might know every single scientific fact about, say, light wavelengths or brain signals or how the eye works, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they know the actual fundamental experience of red or color or anything like that if they've never actually had it before. And this leads us to the hard problem of consciousness, which asks, how do these subjective experiences arise from just purely physical stuff like neurons firing in our brain? Yeah, we have very powerful scientific tools for studying the brain, and they can tell us a lot about the mechanics of the mind, that being which parts of the brain activate when we recall a memory or how neurons communicate, and so on and so forth. And those investigations tackle what Chalmers calls the quote-unquote easy problems, although they're not easy in practice, they're more so easier in principle. This is figuring out the natural mechanisms behind abilities and behaviors of our brain. Because we might one day map out exactly how electrical patterns in the brain allow us to do things like recognize faces, or how certain circuits give rise to emotions, and that would be an incredible achievement. But even if we had this hypothetical complete wiring diagram of the brain and could simulate every single neuron perfectly, there's this further mystery that remains unanswered by that. And that's, would that simulation, or the brain itself, have an inner feeling of being alive? Another way to think about this is, why aren't we all philosophical zombies, or creatures that behave indistinguishably from a conscious human because they have the same exact hardware, but they don't actually have the same subjective experience? The hard problem highlights that there seems to be this fundamental explanatory gap between the brain's functions and the existence of our inner movie, or the way things actually feel to us. Another way to think about this is how can physical interactions of billions of neurons actually create the sensations of pain or the taste of cinnamon that we have day to day? Because it's as if this consciousness is an extra ingredient that we can detect on ourselves directly, internally, or from the inside, of course. But when we look at the brain from the outside, all we see is neuron synapses and chemicals, and really no obvious trace of the vivid colors and sounds of the mind's eye. So different philosophers and scientists have proposed very different answers to explain this. Some say that maybe consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe, and this is a view known as panpsychism. Or maybe our understanding of matter is incomplete, and we'll eventually discover how to bridge the gap, and that'll include consciousness along the way. So others suspect that our usual scientific methods might never fully capture subjective experience because it's simply something that's unique and beyond the domain of science. To this end, Tim Crane, in his book The Mechanical Mind, introduces readers to these debates by examining what it would mean for a mind to be a machine. That is, if the mind is completely mechanical, or just a complex mechanism following the laws of physics, then where does consciousness fit in? Because Crane points out that if we treat the mind as just a causal machine that behaves predictably, then we still face this fundamental question, that is, if a mind is simply a mechanism, how can it be conscious? Or in other words, even a perfect mechanical theory of how the mind works would still need to explain that elusive feeling of actually being the one who's thinking or feeling. Now, the reason this problem is so important for our topic is that mind uploading and AI force us to consider this issue in a very concrete way. That is, if we try to copy or transfer our mind to a different medium like silicon chips, we just have to ask, will the results have the same exact quality as us? Or could a digital mind enjoy the taste of virtual chocolate in a virtual world? Could it feel the same pain and happiness as we do? Or would it be just a brilliant machine that mimics our behavior with no inner life, or no consciousness, or no spark that we know that we have? And if it does have an inner life, is it the same life that the original source mind had, or a brand new, completely separate or distinct one? And these questions bridge from the hard problem into the territory of personal identity and technology, which we're about to explore. But before that, let's clearly lay out what we mean by mind uploading, and the different ways that it might happen. And this is going to give us some concrete scenarios to test our intuitions about consciousness and identity later on. So mind uploading is this very sci-fi sounding idea that's explored by a lot of philosophers and futurists, and at its core, it's this hypothetical process of really copying or transferring a mind from a biological brain to a completely digital medium. And in practice, this is often imagined as creating a completely detailed scan or emulation of someone's brain, down to every single individual neuron, synapse, and all the connections between them, and then running this as a kind of program in a computer so that the computer can effectively think like that person. And if done perfectly, the uploaded mind would have the same exact memories, the same personalities, and the exact same ways of thinking as the original person did at the moment that the scan happened. And it would essentially be a mind on a different substrate, that being silicon and code instead of neurons and biology. So how could this actually be achieved? Because it leaves a lot of the specific details to be determined. So there are a couple few models that have been proposed for mind uploading, each with a kind of different approach and implications for the original brain, and I'll talk about three of the main ones here. So the first one is known as destructive uploading, and this is the dramatic one often seen in science fiction. So it basically involves destroying the brain in the process of uploading. That's a key distinction. So for example, one method you might think is to disassemble the brain bit by bit. You could imagine freezing the brain and then slicing it into ultra-thin layers so that each layer's neural connections can be scanned in ultra-high detail. And those slices obviously can't be put back together. The biological brain is gone when you're done, but in theory, the scan data could be used to reconstruct the entire neural network in a computer. And the end result is that, yeah, the original brain is destroyed, but you end up with this digital mind that is supposed to perfectly emulate the original. And the question is then, is that digital mind really you? And from a first-person perspective, would you have this experience of waking up in the computer, or would you have died during the scanning? And so this destructive uploading idea raises the stakes on the consciousness question, because if the upload isn't conscious, then the person has basically been killed for nothing. So that's the first idea. The second idea is known as non-destructive uploading. And in this scenario, the scanning process doesn't actually harm the original brain. For example, you could think of some advanced brain imaging technologies that could map your entire neural structure while leaving you intact. Perhaps something like super advanced MRI or nanobots that travel to the brain and map everything without destroying it. The key thing is that after the scan, you'd have two versions of the mind, which is the original biological one that's still in your head, that's still you that's walking around, and you'd also have this new digital copy that's running on the computer. And this model might seem more comforting at first because no one has to die to make the copy, but it creates a kind of thorny issue, is that you now have a double. There's the biological you and the digital you. They start out identical in memory and personality up to the scan, but the moment after, they can have completely different experiences and they might even start to diverge. And that raises the question, which one is the real you? Likely we'd say both are persons in their own right, but from the original you's perspective, you might not feel any different. You're still in your body wondering what's for dinner, whereas the uploaded one might be in a virtual world or a robotic body claiming to be you as well. And so non-destructive uploading really forces us to confront the idea of personal identity. That is identity about being a unique individual, or can it branch into two? If you can exist in two places, then what does that even mean for it to be you? And we'll especially explore this more as we talk about different media sources, but finally we'll wrap up this section with talking about gradual uploading or replacement, which is the third way or proposed method of mind uploading. And this approach tries to preserve continuity by doing the transfer in tiny steps rather than all at once. The classic thought experiment here is replacing neurons fully one by one with artificial ones. So you can imagine you have a microscopic robot that attaches to one neuron in your brain, learns exactly how that neuron functions, like its firing patterns, its connections, all that, and then the robot takes over the function of that neuron. The original biological neuron is completely disabled or removed, but you don't notice any sudden change. The robot neuron behaves just like the old one. Now repeat this process one cell at a time over days or months until eventually all your neurons have been replaced by artificial ones, or artificial devices that perform the same exact computations as the original ones that they replaced. And at that point, essentially your entire brain's processing has been ported to non-biological hardware, maybe even transmitted to an external computer. But at no point was there a dramatic on or off where you died. It was more so a continuous process. So proponents of this method say it might preserve what they call the continuity of consciousness, because from your perspective, maybe you feel basically the same throughout the entire thing, perhaps some gradual changes. But then one day you realize, oh, I'm running on a computer now, not on a brain. But I never blacked out, I never experienced a break in my consciousness. You could think of this as analogous to, you might have heard of the ship of Theseus paradox, where if you have a ship and you replace each of the individual planks one by one, is it still the same ship at the end after you've replaced everything? Many will say yes, because if the change is gradual and continuous, then the identity, or the fundamental identity, is preserved. And gradual uploading is often seen as a way to maximize the chance that the uploaded mind is the same conscious being, just smoothly transformed over. However, not everyone agrees it guarantees survival of the self, and we'll get to those debates later on. But these three scenarios, destructive uploading, non-destructive uploading, and gradual uploading, give us a framework to discuss the big questions that Chalmers and others emphasize, that being, will an uploaded mind actually be conscious, and will it be me or someone else? Because it's one thing to end up with a program that talks and acts like the person, but it doesn't actually feel. Then, from the perspective of the person, uploading would be the equivalent to death, just with a convincing imposter left behind. And if it is conscious, but it's essentially a new person, or a kind of branch of you, then uploading might be more like creating a twin rather than extending your own life. So that leads us to think, what do philosophers say about these different possibilities? That is, can a mind made of silicon and code have real qualia and inner experience? And if so, under what conditions is that mind the same person as the original? So we're now going to turn to some philosophical perspectives, focus on ideas from Tim Crane and David Chalmers, to shed light on these issues. So in this section, we're going to tackle two big questions separately. The first is, can a digital or mechanical mind be conscious in the same way that we are? And the second is, what makes it the same person or not, or can it still be you in some way? And eventually, hopefully, you'll see that these two issues are very deeply intertwined. So the first question is, can a digital mind have a subjective experience? So Tim Crane approaches this question by examining what it actually means to think of a mind mechanically. In his book, Mechanical Mind, he explores ideas about minds as information processors, somewhat like computers, and how they represent the world. But Crane is careful to note that just having a mind is not only about processing information. There's also this aspect of experience. For example, suppose we create a computer program that perfectly emulates all of your brain's functions. It reacts to inputs in the same way that you would, it talks about its feelings, and maybe even writes poetry about the taste of strawberries. We're confronted again with the hard problem. Does this emulation actually taste a strawberry in some internal way, or is it just pushing symbols and data around with no actual inner sensation? Crane reminds us that just explaining the input-output behavior, or what he calls the mechanics of thought, doesn't automatically explain the feel of this thought. This is sometimes illustrated by philosopher John Searle's famous Chinese room argument. In this, he poses that you can have a system or a person following a rule book, and by extension a computer. All these are equivalent to a system that takes Chinese characters as input and produces the appropriate Chinese responses. Yet that system doesn't actually understand Chinese, it's just manipulating symbols. And similarly, a computer just running a human brain simulation might conceivably produce all the right responses without any conscious awareness, or in other words, be an intellectual zombie. And Crane's work leads us to be cautious, so the slogan might be, a mind is more than a machine. Or at least, we shouldn't just assume that solving an engineering problem or making something that acts intelligent automatically solves the phenomenological problem that is instantiating a conscious experience. On the other hand, David Chalmers is a philosopher who has thought deeply about consciousness and AI, and he offers a perspective often a bit more optimistic about machine consciousness, with some caveats which we'll discuss. Chalmers coined the term hard problem of consciousness, and is very aware of how mysterious consciousness is. Yet in discussions, for example in his book Reality Plus and other various talks, he suggests the idea of substrate independence, the notion that what matters for generating consciousness might be the pattern and organization of a system, not just the specific material it's made of. And if that's true, then in principle, if you reproduce the same exact information processing structure of a human brain on a computer, then you should get the same exact conscious experiences at the end. Chalmers often uses a thought experiment to illustrate this, which is, imagine replacing neurons with silicon chips one by one, very similar to the gradual upload scenario we described in the last section. If each replacement chip behaves completely identically to the neuron that it replaces, it seems like you wouldn't suddenly lose consciousness just because one neuron got swapped. After all, your other neurons don't actually know that anything changed, because the signals are flowing normally. And if we could accept this premise for just one neuron, then you should be able to extend it to all neurons gradually. And at the end of the process, you're essentially running on silicon, but according to this argument, you've been conscious the entire time with complete experiential continuity. And so if a sudden magical switch to a computer were going to produce a zombie, then at some point in this gradual swap, your consciousness would have to kind of fade or cut off. But it's hard to pinpoint exactly where that would happen if every step is functionally identical from your perspective. Chalmers argues that it's most plausible that consciousness would be preserved through this transition. In other words, he leans towards, yes, an upload can be conscious as long as it's a faithful replication of the right structures. Chalmers is not saying that we know for sure how to make a conscious AI. He's just saying that if consciousness arises from certain informational patterns, then medium doesn't matter, whether it's silicon or neurons. If organized the same way, it should yield the same experience. Of course, he also acknowledges a lingering uncertainty, that nobody fully understands consciousness yet. There is a possibility we might be wrong and something about biology is special, but absent evidence of any type of magical biological ingredient, betting on substrate independence is pretty reasonable in his view. And this perspective is encouraging for those who think that mind uploading could work in the sense that it produces a real mind and not just an imitation. So that leads us to our second question, that is, will the uploaded mind be the same person, or will it still be me? And so this is the personal identity question. Even if we grant that some computer-simulated mind could be conscious, we still have to figure out what it means for that mind to actually be you. Personal identity is a classical philosophical puzzle, even without technology in the mix. We normally think we remain the same person over time despite changes. You're the same person now as when you were a child, even though almost all the cells in your body have turned over and your personality and memories have evolved. So what is it that makes you over time? Some say it's having the same continuous consciousness or memory, meaning that you remember previous experiences and have a continuous stream of awareness, while others might point to having the same body or brain, or perhaps just some psychological continuity where even if memory is lost, as long as each stage of you links to the next in some chain. With uploading, these theories get stress tested in some pretty unique ways. If you do, for example, the first one we discussed, which is destructive uploading, the hope of those who favor it is that the identity transfers to the digital version because of psychological continuity, if the upload remembers being you and thinks it's you. But the worry is that continuity was actually broken because the original died. It's kind of like copying a file and then deleting the original. Is the new file the exact same, or is it just a copy? Many argue it's just a copy, even if identical, but it's not numerically the same entity. While on the flip side, if you do non-destructive uploading, continuity isn't broken for the original, but now you have two continuations. So which one, if any, is the real continuation of you? So the philosopher Derek Parfit famously explored thought experiments like teleportation and copying. For example, you step into a teleporter that disassembles you and reassembles you elsewhere from new atoms. Is the person on the other side, or the other end of the portal, you, or is this just a copy? What if it doesn't destroy the original, and now there are two of you, each claiming to be the original? Parfit concluded that what matters isn't some soul or identity tag, but rather psychological continuity and connectedness. There are two outcomes that are continuous with the original, then effectively, the original person is two future selves. And this sounds disturbing because we're used to identity being one-to-one, but Parfit thought that maybe we might need to let go of the idea of a single absolute identity and focus on the idea that what we really care about, survival-wise, is that someone exists in the future who is like us and remembers our life, even if it isn't strictly a single object continuity. David Chalmers, in discussing how he'd approach uploading himself, leaned towards the gradual replacement method. In an interview, he mused that doing it one neuron at a time provides the strongest case for preserving identity, because at no point do you have a sudden duplicate or a gap in your consciousness. You just slowly transform. In that case, we don't have an awkward two of me scenario. There's always one continuous me, at least from the inside perspective. He acknowledges, though, that personal identity is a very tricky thing to think about. That if you ask philosophers, some will say even with gradual change, you're still the same person as our intuition suggests, while others might say that personal identity is a kind of illusion in some sense, and what really matters is continuity of consciousness and memory. Chalmers himself doesn't claim to have the final answer. He admits uncertainty about the metaphysics of identity, but practically speaking, if one wants to survive via uploading, doing it in a continuous way seems a bit safer in preserving what we care about, at least intuitively. One useful concept here is to distinguish between being qualitatively the same and being numerically the same. That is, an upload can qualitatively be you in that it has the same personality, the same memories, the same patterns of thought, but the harder question is it numerically you, or the very same entity, or is it just a duplicate? If it's destructive uploading and it truly continues your consciousness, maybe you could argue it's numerically you just moved, but that's a matter of perspective and assumption. If it's non-destructive, clearly you end up with two beings where there was one, so numerical identity splits, which most say means that the upload is a new person who is exactly like you at first. Gradual replacement tries to maintain numerical identity by never creating a separate copy at one time, but only instead evolving the original version. To make this more concrete, think of a scenario. You undergo gradual uploading, and after the procedure, there's only one you in a robotic body or VR environment, claiming to remember your entire life and feeling continuous. That being goes on to live for, say, 1,000 years in various virtual worlds. From its perspective, it is absolutely you, just with upgrades. Now consider a different scenario. A copy of you is made while you're still awake and alive, and that copy goes off to a virtual world. You, or the original, remain in your biological body and continue to live in life, and the copy also believes it's you and is having its own experience. Now, we come back 5 years later, the copy has a different life and you've had your own life, and you've essentially diverged. Are they both you in this case? Because you might feel very clearly that you are the one in the biological body and the other one is now some other person, even if you feel some kind of kinship. The copy, on the other hand, might feel unfortunate that it's not accepted as the original by you, and it's a strange situation that challenges how we think about selfhood. In practice, it suggests that uploading would force us to broaden our ideas of personhood. Maybe we'd come to see the upload and the original as twins, starting from a single identity source. Or maybe society would say the original is the legal same person and the upload is a new person with a shared past, sort of like identical twins that happen to have the same memories up to a certain point. So Chalmers and Crane both basically urge us to think carefully. Crane might emphasize, don't just assume a thinking machine is a feeling machine, because consciousness could be missing. Whereas Chalmers would emphasize, it's possible that an uploading process could preserve consciousness and identity, especially with the right approach, but we have to consider uncertainties. Nobody has uploaded on a mind yet, so these remain thought experiments, but importantly, both philosophers and many others highlight that these questions aren't just about some distant future. They cut to the heart of what a mind actually is. That is, are you essentially the information and patterns in your brain, which could be moved to any hardware, or are you essentially the biological organism and its own continuity? If it's the former, uploading might be a way to extend one's life or experience into new media, and if it's the latter, uploading might create interesting new beings, but wouldn't save you in the literal sense and save you from your eventual death. Now, with all this philosophy under our belt, let's step back and see how these ideas appear in culture. Often our novels, films, and art capture the emotional texture of these dilemmas even before we fully intellectualize them. We're going to look at 3 very different cultural works: a postmodern novel, an avant-garde show, and even some pop music that each shed light on what it means to have a self in the age of simulation technology. And hopefully by examining these, we'll ground our philosophical musings in human stories and really cool creative expressions.